Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are now in our second week of instruction after the 3-week layoff, and this week we are looking at a whole hodgepodge of poets, and I feel good about the number of poems that I have you looking at because of the fact that they're all so short. The most important, actually it's hard to name a most important of all these. I'm going to start with the wartime poets from World War I. Bear in mind that historically speaking, when World War I happened, nobody had ever seen such a destructive war. More lives were lost up to that point. Now World War II would eventually surpass it, but at that time, more lives were lost in that war than anybody had ever seen. Europe was pretty much devastated because of something called trench warfare, where people would just die and die and die, but nobody would gain any land. And new weapons were used, like airplanes were really used for the first time in World War I. Poison gas was used as a weapon for the first time in World War I. Machine guns, for the most part, were pretty much the first time used in World War I. And it really redefined Europe as well. Countries like the Ottoman Empire fell, and new countries were formed out of that. Now, here's the thing to know about British literature in World War I. Great Britain, or England and Ireland and Scotland and Wales, Great Britain was pretty much untouched by the war. It was insulated from it. So why is that important for this class? A lot of people in Britain were saying, hey, we are patriots. And a lot of them were saying, a lot of the young men were saying, we're going to go die for our country because it's a beautiful thing to die for our country. The truth was, it was horrific. The truth was, a lot of these deaths were very painful, and a lot of these deaths were very gruesome, and there was really no joy in dying for one's country. So what does that mean for our readings this week? For the World War I poetry, we've got 3 different poets. We've got Rupert Brooke, who said, if I die for my country, it's a beautiful thing. And if I get buried on a foreign land, the peace of Britain will be buried there too. It's awesome. Well, 2 other soldiers by the name of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen said, not so fast. We are soldiers. We've been in the trenches. We've seen people die. And let me tell you, dying for one's country is not a wonderful thing. In fact, dying for one's country is painful, it's gruesome, and nobody should have to do that. So, what that means is, you had 2 different sides. The dying for one's country is beautiful, dying for one's country is not so beautiful. And you'll get to take a look at the conflict between Brooke and between Sassoon and Owen. All right, then we got William Butler Yeats. You could not possibly have a 20th century British literature class without including Yeats in it. He wrote poetry for about 50 years. What you're going to get here is 2 out of his 3 stages. I left out the stage where he looked at mythology, particularly his poem Leda and the Swan, which if you have time to read it, is worth a read. But I do have Lake Isle of Innisfree, which, William Butler Yeats was an Irish poet. So the fact that he comes from Ireland is very important here because he said, all right, we're going to look at the Gaelic poetry. We're going to look at ancient poetry from Ireland, or what was at the time, where Ireland is today, what was at the time like Celtic poetry and things like that. And he wrote Lake Isle of Innisfree, which is all about nature and all about getting away from the city and all about the beauty of nature. Then we get Easter 1916. And this is based upon an incident that occurred on Easter 1916 where the Irish decided they wanted to break free from Great Britain and have their own little country. It seemed perfect at the time because England was fighting a war over in Europe. So Irish people thought, well, they got all their soldiers over in Europe. We're not going to have much resistance if we say, hey, we are Ireland, we're going to break free from the United Kingdom. Problem was there were plenty of British soldiers still in Britain. And so they came in on Easter 1916 and they basically took Dublin over, and all the people that were leading the uprising were executed. And many of these people were friends of Yeats. Yeats was torn. Yeats was a British poet, yet he was from Ireland, and he felt an allegiance to both countries. What in the world do you do? Well, so he writes this poem, and the main phrase of this is, "A terrible beauty is born." And you can analyze that to death. So figure out what that means as you read that. Then we've got T.S. Eliot, who is the face of modernism in Great Britain. T.S. Eliot, ironically enough, was born in the United States. He was born in St. Louis. But he went over to England, fell in love with a woman over there, renounced his United States citizenship, became a British citizen. And while there, became probably the major contributor to modernist poetry in all of England. And so the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is what we call Stream of Consciousness. It's about a man who is in a brothel of all things, sitting there, observing everything that's going on, plus he's worried about what the girls, the pretty women who are being, sold for sex or whatever, what they think of him. He's an old man with a receding hairline, a bald spot in the back of his head. He's worried about his manners. Does he dare eat a peach? Things like that. Plus, he gets this whole thing like, well, I'd have been better off if I was just some kind of crab scumming across the floors of silent seas than I would have been if I was a human being who was self-aware. So you've got that one. And then you've got Dylan Thomas. Probably one of the most famous British poems ever written was "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night." And the thing to know about that one is he was writing that for his father. His father was dying from illness. And he wanted his father, even though he knew his father would, it would be the easy way to go to just give up and die. Right? He's suffering, he's in pain, all this stuff. But it's, Dylan saying, "Hey, Dad, please don't go gentle in that good night. Fight your way. Keep fighting the good fight. And then if the illness takes you, then it takes you." And is still to this day one of the most famous British poems ever written. Ironically enough, Dylan Thomas would die at a very young age himself, much younger at his age when he died than what his father was at his age when he died. So a lot of poetry going on, a lot of stuff to look at, but I think that this little catch-all hodgepodge kind of poetry thing pretty much embodies British poetry in the first half of the 20th century, and you'll get a good taste for the variety of poetry that was written at that time. So make sure that you take your quiz, make sure that you write your paper, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.